My name is Margaret Williams. I'm 58 years old, and tonight I finally discovered what it feels like to have your own family treat you like a stranger at your own birthday dinner. As I sit here in my car outside Romano's Italian restaurant, my hands still trembling from what just happened, the engine running but going nowhere, I can barely process how we got to this point. The leather steering wheel is cold under my palms, and the parking lot lights are casting long shadows across my windshield, but I'm not ready to drive home yet. I need to tell you this story because maybe, just maybe, some of you watching this will recognize the signs I ignored for far too long. 3 hours ago, I was getting ready for what I thought would be a beautiful evening celebrating my 58th birthday with my son, Daniel, and his wife, Ashley. I spent 2 full hours getting ready, choosing the navy blue dress Daniel always said looked beautiful on me, the one his father bought me for our 25th wedding anniversary years ago. The fabric still felt luxurious against my skin, and when I looked in the mirror, I could almost see the woman Robert fell in love with all those decades ago. I did my hair at Salon Vivian downtown, got my nails done at the little place on Maple Street where they always remember my name, and I even bought a new lipstick because Ashley had once mentioned, in that carefully casual way of hers, that I should try bolder colors to brighten up my complexion. I wanted everything to be perfect because family dinners had become so rare since Daniel got married 2 years ago. There was a time when we'd spend every Sunday together, when my phone would ring daily with his voice on the other end, when I was the first person he called with good news or bad news or no news at all. Those days felt like a lifetime ago now, replaced by carefully scheduled interactions that felt more like business meetings than family gatherings. If you're watching this story unfold, please hit that like button and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Your support means everything right now, and I have a feeling I'm going to need all the strength I can get for what comes next. Sometimes we need to know we're not alone in our experiences, that somewhere out there, someone understands what it feels like to become invisible in your own family. The restaurant Daniel chose was upscale, the kind of place where the waiters wear white gloves and the wine list has prices that would make most people faint. Romano's had been featured in the City magazine as one of the top 10 romantic dining destinations, with its dim lighting, soft jazz music, and tables set far enough apart that conversations felt intimate and private. When I arrived, fashionably 5 minutes late as my mother had always taught me, they were already seated at a corner table near the window. Ashley's perfectly manicured hand was resting possessively on Daniel's arm as she whispered something in his ear that made him laugh, that genuine throaty laugh I remembered from his childhood when I'd tell him silly jokes or funny stories about his father. They looked like the perfect young couple, him in his expensive charcoal gray suit that probably cost more than my monthly car payment, her in a designer black dress that hugged her curves in all the right places and probably had a price tag that would make my eyes water. The sight of them together still took my breath away sometimes, but not always in a good way. Daniel had grown into such a handsome man, with his father's strong jawline and my green eyes, and sitting across from his beautiful wife, they looked like they belonged on the cover of a lifestyle magazine. They were the kind of couple that other people envied, the kind that made restaurant hostesses smile a little brighter and waiters linger a little longer at their table. "Mom!" Daniel stood up to hug me, and for just a moment everything felt normal again. He smelled like the expensive cologne I'd bought him last Christmas, mixed with the familiar scent that had been uniquely his since he was a baby. His embrace was warm and familiar, strong arms that had once reached for me when he had nightmares, that had hugged me tight when his father died, that had lifted me off my feet when he graduated from Stanford with honors. But then, Ashley's voice cut through the moment like ice water poured over a candle flame. "Margaret, you look nice." The pause before nice lasted just long enough to feel like a slap across the face. Her smile was perfectly practiced, the kind she'd perfected during her sorority days at UCLA, I was sure. Everything about Ashley was calculated and precise, from her honey blonde highlights that were touched up every 6 weeks religiously, to her strategically placed Botox injections that kept her looking perpetually surprised and youthful, to the way she could deliver an insult wrapped in a compliment so skillfully that you almost thanked her for it. I should have known then that this dinner would be different from what I'd hoped for, what I'd spent 2 weeks anticipating, but I was determined to make it work, to bridge whatever gap had formed between us since their wedding day. I was willing to try, to extend olive branches to be the bigger person if it meant salvaging some kind of relationship with the woman my son had chosen to spend his life with. I settled into my chair, smoothed my dress carefully, and smiled back at her with all the warmth I could muster from somewhere deep inside my chest. "Thank you, dear. You look absolutely stunning as always." And she did. Ashley always looked like she'd stepped out of the pages of Vogue magazine, even when she was just running errands or grabbing coffee. It was one of the things that had initially attracted Daniel to her, I think. The way she could make everything look effortless while probably spending hours achieving that perfect, natural look that took more time and money than most people spent on their entire wardrobe. The foundation of tension. To understand what happened tonight, you need to know the full story of how we got to this point. It's not just about one bad dinner or one moment of conflict. It's about a systematic erosion that happened so gradually, I almost didn't notice it until it was too late. Daniel is my only child, the absolute light of my life since the day he was born 29 years ago, after 8 hours of labor and more love than I thought my heart could hold. His father, my late husband Robert, passed away when Daniel was just 15 years old, leaving me to raise him alone through his crucial teenage years and into adulthood. Robert had been my college sweetheart, the man who taught me what real love looked like, who showed me that partnership meant lifting each other up rather than tearing each other down. When he died of a sudden heart attack on a Tuesday morning in March, both Daniel and I were devastated, but we had each other to lean on. We became incredibly close during those years after Robert's death. It was us against the world, and somehow we made it work. I worked double shifts at the high school where I was vice principal, taking on extra responsibilities to pay for Daniel's college prep courses and extracurricular activities. Daniel threw himself into his studies with an intensity that sometimes worried me, but I understood it was his way of processing grief and honoring his father's memory. Daniel excelled in everything he touched during those years. He was valedictorian of his high school class, earned a full scholarship to Stanford University, and by 25, he was making more money in his tech job than Robert and I had ever dreamed of earning combined. I was so incredibly proud of the man he'd become, the way he'd channeled his pain from losing his father into motivation to succeed, to make something meaningful of his life. When Daniel first brought Ashley home 3 years ago during his spring break, I genuinely tried so hard to like her. She was undeniably beautiful, with those carefully maintained blonde highlights and that perfect smile that never seemed to falter. She was successful in her own right as a marketing executive at a prestigious firm downtown, and she made Daniel smile in a way I hadn't seen since his father died. They had met at some corporate networking event, and she swept into our lives like a perfectly orchestrated tornado, changing everything in her path. At first, the changes were so subtle I almost missed them entirely. Daniel started canceling our weekly Sunday dinners, claiming he was busy with work projects or that Ashley had made other plans for them that he couldn't get out of. Our daily phone calls, which had been a constant in our lives for over a decade, became every other day, then twice a week, then just when I called him first and he happened to be free to talk. When I'd ask to spend time with just him, like we used to do before Ashley came into the picture, she would somehow always end up being included in the plans, or the arrangements would mysteriously change at the last minute. Movie nights became double dates with Ashley's friends. Our traditional Saturday morning breakfast became Sunday brunch with Ashley and whoever she deemed worthy of inclusion. The wedding planning period was where things really started to unravel in ways I couldn't ignore anymore. I offered to help with everything, wanting to be involved in this major milestone in my son's life. I'd been dreaming of his wedding day since he was a little boy playing dress-up in my closets, imagining the moment I'd dance with him at the reception, helping him with his tie before the ceremony. All those precious mother-son moments you see in movies and read about in magazines. Ashley, however, had completely different ideas about my level of involvement. Every single suggestion I made was politely but firmly dismissed, with explanations that always made me feel foolish for having offered. The venue I recommended, a beautiful historic mansion where Robert and I had attended several weddings, wasn't sophisticated enough for their crowd. The flowers I thought were beautiful, classic white roses and baby's breath, were too traditional and boring for their vision. The menu items I suggested, comfort foods that had meaning in our family, weren't trendy enough for their guest list. Slowly but surely, I was edged out of every decision, relegated to the role of check writer and wedding guest rather than mother of the groom. I found myself writing checks for vendors I'd never met, for decisions I'd had no part in making, for a celebration that felt more like Ashley's personal showcase than a union between two families. The final straw during the wedding planning process came when I discovered, through my sister Carol, who heard it from her neighbor who knew Ashley's cousin, that Ashley had gone wedding dress shopping with her mother, 3 bridesmaids, and her future sister-in-law. When I asked Daniel about it later that evening, calling him after I'd spent an hour crying in my kitchen, he looked genuinely confused and uncomfortable. "I thought Ashley told you about that," he said, but I could see in his eyes that he knew she hadn't. He knew she had deliberately excluded me from one of the most important traditions in wedding planning, and he'd said nothing about it. That was when I first realized that Ashley wasn't just thoughtless or overwhelmed by wedding planning. She was deliberate and strategic in her exclusion of me from my son's life. The wedding and its aftermath. The wedding itself was beautiful in the way that expensive things often are, perfectly coordinated, flawlessly executed, and completely devoid of warmth or personality. It took place at the Grandview Country Club, a venue that cost more for one evening than I'd spent on my entire wedding to Robert. Every detail was magazine perfect, from the imported flowers that had been flown in from some exotic location to the live orchestra that played during dinner. But despite all the money and planning that had gone into making it perfect, I felt like an outsider at my own son's wedding. I sat in the front row during the ceremony, as was traditional for the mother of the groom, but I felt miles away from the celebration happening around me. Ashley's family dominated everything. Her parents hosted the rehearsal dinner at an exclusive restaurant where the cheapest entree cost more than my weekly grocery budget. Her mother was treated like royalty throughout the entire weekend, and her extended family seemed to fill every important role in the celebration. During the reception, Ashley's father gave a 20-minute speech about welcoming Daniel into their family, sharing embarrassing childhood stories about Ashley, and talking about their hopes and dreams for the couple's future. When it was my turn to speak, I was allotted exactly 3 minutes, and Ashley's wedding planner actually tapped her watch at me when I reached the 3-minute mark, as if my words about the son I'd raised alone were somehow less important than the carefully rehearsed remarks that had come before mine. The photographer, who had been hired by Ashley's parents, seemed to have very specific instructions about which family combinations were important to capture. I was barely included in the formal family photos, relegated to a few obligatory shots, while Ashley's extended family took what seemed like hundreds of pictures in every possible combination. When I asked if we could take a few photos of just Daniel and me, the way I'd always imagined we would at his wedding, the photographer checked with Ashley first, as if my request needed her approval. After the honeymoon, which was a 2-week trip to Europe that I heard about through Ashley's Instagram posts rather than from my son directly, things got significantly worse. Daniel and Ashley moved into a beautiful house in Maple Ridge Estates, a suburban development where the houses all looked like they'd been designed by the same architect and cost more than most people made in a decade. Suddenly, my invitations to family gatherings became scarce and conditional. They'd host dinner parties and game nights that I'd hear about through mutual friends or see evidence of on social media, but I was rarely included. Their social circle seemed to consist entirely of young couples in their late 20s and early 30s, people with similar jobs and lifestyles and no apparent interest in including anyone from an older generation. When I was invited to events at their house, it felt obligatory and uncomfortable, like Ashley was checking off a box on her good daughter-in-law checklist rather than genuinely wanting me there. I'd arrived to find conversations already in progress about people I didn't know, inside jokes I wasn't part of, and plans being made for future gatherings that didn't include me. The kitchen in their new house was gorgeous, with granite countertops and professional-grade appliances, but Ashley made it clear that it was her domain. When I offered to bring a dish to their first Thanksgiving as homeowners, she politely declined, saying she had everything under control. When I asked if there was anything I could do to help with preparations, she suggested I could just relax and enjoy being a guest, a phrase that somehow made me feel more excluded than included. The holiday exclusions. The holidays last year were when I truly understood how completely Ashley had rewritten the rules of our family dynamic, erasing traditions that had been sacred to Daniel and me for decades. For 37 years since the Christmas after Daniel was born, we had spent Christmas Eve together, just the two of us, honoring a tradition that Robert had started when he was so overwhelmed with love for his new son that he wanted to create something special just for our little family. Every Christmas Eve, we'd make homemade hot chocolate using Robert's grandmother's recipe, watch classic movies like It's a Wonderful Life and Miracle on 34th Street, and exchange one special gift before the chaos of Christmas Day with extended family and friends. It was our time to be quiet together, to reflect on the year that had passed and to share what we were most grateful for. Even during Daniel's teenage years, when he was more interested in friends than family, he'd never missed our Christmas Eve tradition. 2 weeks before Christmas last year, Daniel called with news that hit me like a physical blow to the chest. They'd be spending Christmas Eve with Ashley's family instead, he explained in a voice that sounded rehearsed and uncomfortable. It's important to Ashley that we start our own traditions as a married couple, he said, and I could hear her coaching him in the background, her voice a low murmur of instructions and encouragement. When I suggested we could do our traditional evening on December 23rd instead, maintaining the spirit of our celebration, even if we had to adjust the date, He hesitated for so long, I thought the call had dropped. The silence stretched between us, filled with years of shared memories and the growing realization that those memories weren't as important to him as I'd thought they were. Mom, Ashley thinks it might be time for us to evolve past some of these old traditions. We're married now, and we need to prioritize our nuclear family. Nuclear family. Those words hit me like a physical blow, knocking the breath out of my lungs and leaving me gasping for air. I had been demoted from family to extended family, from essential to optional, from included to excluded, and the most heartbreaking part was that Daniel seemed to accept this new hierarchy without question or resistance. Christmas Day was awkward and painful in ways I hadn't anticipated. I spent the morning alone in my house, surrounded by decorations that suddenly felt pointless and gifts that would never be opened the way I'd always imagined. When I arrived at Daniel and Ashley's house for dinner, I walked into a celebration that was already in full swing, with Ashley's parents holding court in the living room and her siblings and their children scattered throughout the house like they owned the place. I felt like a guest in my son's home, someone who'd been invited out of obligation rather than genuine desire for my company. Ashley's mother, Patricia, was seated in what I'd always considered the place of honor, the comfortable chair near the fireplace where the matriarch of the family would traditionally hold court. I was directed to a spot on the couch between Ashley's teenage niece and her college-aged nephew, both of whom were more interested in their phones than conversation. New Year's Eve brought its own special form of humiliation that I'm still processing months later. They threw a party at their house, and I found out about it through a photo on Ashley's Instagram account that showed up in my feed 3 days after the fact. The picture showed about 20 people celebrating in my son's living room, all of them young and beautiful and successful looking, champagne glasses raised in celebration of the new year. When I mentioned seeing the photos to Daniel a few days later, he had the grace to look embarrassed, but his explanation made everything worse. It was last minute, Mom. Ashley organized it with her work friends, and it was more of a young professionals thing. Young professionals thing. The phrase echoed in my head for days afterward. I was 57 years old, not 97. I had a successful career as a high school principal before I retired. I could hold my own in any conversation, but apparently I was too old, too boring, too much of a mother to fit into their sophisticated social circle. Valentine's Day brought its own special form of humiliation that I'm still trying to process. Ashley posted a photo on social media of an elaborate dinner Daniel had prepared for her, complete with rose petals scattered across their dining room table, candles flickering in the dim light, and what looked like a 5-course meal laid out with restaurant-quality presentation. The caption read, "So grateful for a man who knows how to treat the most important woman in his life right. It's your blessed, lucky girl, the perfect husband. The most important woman in his life." I stared at those words for probably 10 minutes, reading them over and over again, trying to process the implications. I had held that title for 43 years through scraped knees and broken hearts, through his father's sudden death and the difficult years that followed, through college stress and job interviews and apartment hunting, and every major milestone of his life. Now I'd been replaced officially and publicly, and apparently I wasn't even supposed to mind. The birthday dinner proposition. 2 weeks ago, on a Thursday evening while I was grading papers from the tutoring I'd started doing to fill my empty days, Daniel called with what I initially thought was wonderful news. His voice on the phone sounded warmer than it had in months, more like the sun I remembered from before Ashley had become the filter through which all our interactions passed. "Mom, Ashley and I want to take you out for your birthday. Somewhere really nice, our treat. It'll be special. just the three of us. The words filled me with such hope and relief that I had to sit down at my kitchen table to process them properly. Maybe Ashley was finally ready to include me more in their lives. Maybe she'd realized how much I meant to Daniel and wanted to make a genuine effort to build a relationship with me. I spent those 2 weeks looking forward to the dinner with an anticipation that felt almost childish in its intensity. I imagined conversations where we might finally connect on a deeper level, where I might get to know the woman my son loved enough to marry, where she might see me as a person rather than an obstacle to be managed. Daniel suggested Romano's Italian restaurant, one of the most expensive and well-regarded establishments in the city. Ashley chose it, he said, and I was genuinely impressed that she'd put thought into selecting somewhere sophisticated and special. The restaurant had been featured in Food and Wine magazine, and making reservations there typically required weeks of advance planning. The fact that they'd managed to secure a table for my birthday felt like a gesture of genuine care and consideration. I made an appointment at Salon Vivian for the afternoon of my birthday, asking for their best stylist and explaining that this was a special occasion. I bought a new dress from Nordstrom, a navy blue sheath that was more expensive than anything I'd purchased for myself in years, but that made me feel elegant and confident when I looked in the mirror. I even splurged on new shoes and a matching handbag, wanting to look like I belonged in the upscale restaurant Ashley had chosen. The day before the dinner, Ashley called me directly, which was unusual enough to make me immediately concerned. She typically communicated with me through Daniel, using him as a buffer for any interaction we might need to have. Her voice on the phone carried that practiced sweetness that always made me feel like I was being managed rather than spoken to, like she was following a script she'd rehearsed. "Margaret, I wanted to talk to you about tomorrow night," she began, and I could hear something in her tone that I couldn't quite identify. Was it concern, control, condescension? "Daniel is really excited about this dinner, and I want it to be perfect for both of you." I was encouraged by her apparent thoughtfulness until she continued speaking, and the real purpose of her call became clear. "I just wanted to mention that Daniel's been under a lot of stress at work lately with this new project he's managing, and he's been really looking forward to a peaceful, relaxing evening. You know how sensitive he is to tension or drama, especially after everything he went through with his father's death." There it was, the veiled warning wrapped in concern for my son, the implication that I was somehow responsible for creating tension or drama in situations where I was simply trying to exist as his mother. I wasn't sure exactly what she was implying, but the message was crystal clear. Behave yourself. Don't cause problems. Keep the peace at all costs. Of course, Ashley. I want Daniel to enjoy himself too. I'm just looking forward to spending time with both of you and celebrating together. Great. I knew you'd understand. Her voice took on that patronizing tone that I'd grown to despise, the one she used when she wanted to make it clear that she was in charge of the situation. "And, Margaret, let's try to keep the conversation light and positive tonight. No heavy topics or anything that might make Daniel uncomfortable or upset." After she hung up, I sat holding the phone for several minutes, trying to process what had just happened. What heavy topics was she worried I might bring up? Why did she feel the need to coach me on how to behave at dinner with my own son? And when had my presence become something that needed to be managed and controlled rather than welcomed and celebrated? But I pushed those concerns aside, determined not to let Ashley's controlling behavior ruin what I hoped would be a special evening. This was my birthday dinner, a chance to reconnect with my son and possibly build a better relationship with his wife. I was willing to follow her rules if it meant achieving those goals. The dinner begins. Walking into Romano's tonight, I felt a mixture of anticipation and anxiety that I couldn't quite shake, like butterflies and lead weights competing for space in my stomach. The restaurant was everything I'd expected from the reviews I'd read online, dimly lit with warm golden lighting that made everyone look more attractive, soft jazz playing at just the right volume to create atmosphere without interfering with conversation, and servers who moved with the practiced elegance of dancers performing a well-rehearsed routine. The hostess, a young woman with perfectly styled dark hair and a smile that could have sold toothpaste, led me through the dining room to a corner table near the windows that overlooked the city lights. Daniel and Ashley were already seated, and the sight of them together still took my breath away sometimes, though not always in the way it used to. Daniel had grown into such a handsome man, with his father's strong jawline and intelligent brown eyes, and sitting across from his beautiful wife in this upscale setting, they looked like they belonged on the cover of a lifestyle magazine advertising the perfect American dream. "Happy birthday, Mom," Daniel said, standing to embrace me with genuine warmth. His hug lingered a moment longer than Ashley's typical quick, perfunctory squeeze, and I savored every second of it, breathing in the familiar scent that had been uniquely his since he was a baby, now mixed with expensive cologne and the confidence of adulthood. This was my son, the boy I'd raised through skinned knees and broken hearts, the man I'd helped shape through his father's death and all the challenges that followed. Ashley had clearly arrived early enough to settle in and establish the tone for the evening. She'd ordered wine before I arrived, an expensive bottle of Italian red that she pronounced with perfect inflection when explaining their selection to our server, demonstrating the kind of sophisticated knowledge that came from wine tastings and cooking classes I'd never been invited to attend. She looked absolutely stunning in a black cocktail dress that probably cost more than my monthly car payment. Her honey blonde hair swept up in an elegant chignon that showed off diamond earrings that caught the candlelight every time she moved her head. Everything about Ashley was always perfectly coordinated and strategically chosen, from her manicured nails to her designer shoes to the subtle but expensive perfume that created an invisible barrier around her. "You look beautiful, Mom," Daniel said, and I felt a warm glow of pride spread through my chest. I'd chosen my outfit carefully. The navy dress that had always been his favorite, paired with the pearl necklace Robert had given me for our 10th anniversary, and the new shoes I'd splurged on for this special occasion. "Thank you, sweetheart. You both look absolutely wonderful." And they did. They looked like the kind of couple that other people envied, successful and attractive, and perfectly matched in all the ways that mattered to the outside world. The conversation started pleasantly enough, with Daniel asking about my week and Ashley contributing appropriate responses at all the right moments. But as the evening progressed, I began to notice a familiar pattern that I'd experienced at every family gathering since their wedding. Ashley dominated most of the conversation, talking about her latest promotion at work, their plans to renovate their kitchen with some designer I'd never heard of, and a charity gala they'd attended the previous weekend where they'd been photographed for the society pages. I listened attentively, asked appropriate questions about her work and their plans, and tried to contribute to the conversation when opportunities presented themselves. But every time I started to share something about my own life, Ashley would interrupt with a related story about herself or redirect the conversation back to her and Daniel's shared experiences and future plans. When I mentioned that I'd started volunteering at the literacy center downtown, working with adults who were learning to read later in life, Ashley immediately launched into a detailed description of her company's volunteer program and how it had helped raise her profile with the senior partners at her firm. When I tried to tell Daniel about my recent trip to visit his Aunt Sarah in Portland, Ashley began discussing their vacation planning for next summer and how they were considering a trip to Europe that would be more extensive than their honeymoon. I found myself becoming quieter as the main course arrived, simply listening as Ashley performed what felt like a one-woman show designed to showcase her perfect life with my son. Daniel seemed oblivious to the dynamic that was playing out, laughing at her stories and adding his own commentary when prompted, but never seeming to notice that I'd been relegated to the role of audience member rather than participant in the conversation. The breaking point came when I tried to share a funny story about something that had happened at the grocery store earlier in the week, an encounter with an elderly man who'd reminded me so much of Robert that I'd been moved to tears in the cereal aisle. I was only 3 sentences into the story when Ashley's phone buzzed with a text message. "Oh, this is important," she said, immediately picking up her phone and beginning to type a response without even looking up to acknowledge that I'd been speaking. She continued texting for several minutes while I trailed off mid-sentence, looking at Daniel for some kind of acknowledgement or encouragement to continue. But he was checking his own phone now, apparently responding to something work-related that couldn't wait until after dinner. I sat there in complete silence, my story unfinished and forgotten, watching my son and his wife prioritize their devices over conversation with me on my birthday. "Sorry, Mom, what were you saying?" Daniel asked after several minutes, but Ashley was already launching into a new topic about their friend's recent engagement and the elaborate proposal that had involved a flash mob and a mariachi band. I realized in that moment that I had become background noise in my own son's life, decoration rather than company, an obligation to be endured rather than a person to be enjoyed. Don't make a scene tonight. As we waited for dessert, the weight of the evening's dynamics pressing down on me like a physical force, I excused myself to go to the restroom, needing a moment to collect myself and decide how to salvage what was left of this disaster of a birthday celebration. The bathroom at Romano's was as elegant as the rest of the restaurant, with marble countertops imported from Italy, soft lighting that was surprisingly flattering, and the kind of luxurious hand soap that probably cost more per bottle than I spent on groceries in a week. I stared at myself in the mirror, trying to recognize the woman looking back at me. When had I become so invisible? When had my own son started treating me like an obligation rather than someone he genuinely wanted to spend time with? And when had I started accepting this treatment as normal, as something I deserved or had somehow brought upon myself? I took a deep breath, reapplied my lipstick with hands that trembled slightly, and decided to try one more time to connect with them. Maybe if I could get Daniel talking about something we used to share, something that predated Ashley's influence on his life, we could find our way back to each other. Maybe I could remind him of who we used to be together before everything became so complicated and controlled. When I returned to the table, they were looking at photos on Ashley's phone, their heads close together as they scrolled through images from some recent event I apparently hadn't been invited to attend. They looked up when I sat down, but Ashley didn't put her phone away, continuing to swipe through photos while maintaining the pretense of including me in the conversation. "Daniel," I began, my voice carrying more emotion than I'd intended, "do you remember that time when you were 12 and we got caught in that terrible thunderstorm on the way home from your baseball game? We had to pull over under that overpass and wait it out, and you were so scared of the lightning that you made me tell you stories about your dad to distract you from the noise." Daniel's face softened immediately, and for a moment I saw my little boy again, the child who used to crawl into my bed during storms and beg for stories about his father to help him feel safe and connected to the man he'd lost too young. "I remember that," he said, and his voice carried a warmth and genuineness that had been missing from the entire evening until that moment. "You told me about the time Dad got lost on your first date and ended up at that weird restaurant with the singing waiters instead of the fancy place he'd planned to take you. And you laughed so hard you forgot all about the storm," I continued, feeling a genuine smile spread across my face for the first time all evening. "We sat there for almost an hour, and by the time the rain stopped, you knew every embarrassing story I could remember about your father's romantic disasters. For just a moment, it felt like we were connected again, like the years of distance and manipulation had melted away and we were simply mother and son sharing a precious memory. I could see the love in Daniel's eyes, the affection that hadn't been completely erased by Ashley's systematic campaign to minimize my importance in his life, but Ashley wasn't having it. She set her phone down with a deliberate snap that sounded like a gunshot in the intimate atmosphere of the restaurant and fixed me with a look that was pure steel wrapped in silk, cold and calculating and absolutely unmistakable in its intent. That's sweet. But Daniel and I were actually just discussing our plans for next month. We're thinking about taking a long weekend trip to Napa Valley for wine tasting and spa treatments. She turned to Daniel with a possessive smile that made my stomach clench. Just the two of us, like a second honeymoon. We've both been working so hard lately that we really need some quality time together. The message was crystal clear. Stop trying to pull him back into your shared past. His future is with me now, and I won't allow you to interfere with that by reminding him of who he used to be before I became the center of his universe. I felt something crack inside me, like the sound of ice breaking on a frozen pond. But I tried one more time to maintain the connection I'd briefly established with my son. That sounds lovely. "You know, Robert and I went to Napa for our—" "Margaret." Ashley's voice cut through my words like a blade, sharp and final, and brooking no argument. She leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping to a whisper that somehow felt more threatening than if she'd shouted across the restaurant. "I think we should keep tonight focused on celebrating you, don't you? Let's not dwell on the past." The way she said the past made it sound like something distasteful and inappropriate, something to be discarded and forgotten rather than cherished and shared. My entire history with Daniel, all the years I'd spent raising him and loving him and sacrificing for him, reduced to something inconvenient that was cluttering up her perfect narrative of their life together. But it was what she said next that broke something fundamental inside me, something that could never be repaired or forgotten. She placed her hand over mine with fake gentleness, her perfectly manicured fingers cold against my skin, her voice taking on that patronizing tone I'd grown to despise more than anything else in the world. "Don't make a scene tonight, Margaret. This dinner is supposed to be about celebrating you, and I'd hate for Daniel to remember his mother's birthday as the night you caused drama at such a nice restaurant. We both know how much you mean to him, and I'm sure you don't want to ruin this special evening with unnecessary emotional outbursts. Don't make a scene." The words echoed in my head like a slap across the face, as if wanting to have a conversation with my own son was causing drama, as if sharing memories of his father was inappropriate behavior that needed to be managed and controlled, as if my very existence was something that required her permission and approval. I looked at Daniel, waiting for him to say something, to defend me, to acknowledge that what his wife had just said was completely out of line and unacceptable. But he was looking at his plate, avoiding eye contact, apparently content to let Ashley police our conversation and dictate the terms of our relationship. That's when I knew exactly what I had to do. The note. I excused myself from the table again, but this time I didn't go to the restroom. Instead, I walked directly to our server, Michael, who had been attentive and professional throughout the evening, the kind of experienced waiter who could read the dynamics at a table and adjust his service accordingly. He was standing near the server station, polishing wine glasses with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd been doing this job for years and took pride in the details. "Excuse me," I said quietly, pulling him aside to a spot near the kitchen entrance where Daniel and Ashley couldn't see us from their table. "I need to ask you for a favor, and I know this might seem unusual, but it's very important." Michael looked concerned, probably wondering if there was a problem with our service or the food that needed to be addressed. His eyebrows raised slightly, but his expression remained professional and attentive. "Of course, Mom. How can I help you?" I pulled out a pen from my purse, a silver cross pen that Robert had given me for my 40th birthday, and grabbed a clean napkin from the server station. My hands were steady as I wrote, even though my heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. The words came easily, as if I'd been rehearsing them my entire life without knowing it, as if they'd been waiting inside me for exactly this moment. "I need you to deliver this note to the young man at my table in exactly 5 minutes, I told Michael, folding the napkin carefully and precisely. "The one in the navy suit, not his wife, just him. It's very important that you give it directly to him and no one else. Can you do that for me?" Michael glanced over at our table where Daniel and Ashley were engaged in what looked like an intense conversation, their heads close together as they spoke in low voices. He looked back at me, and something in my expression must have conveyed the seriousness of the situation, because he nodded without asking any questions. "Of course, ma'am. 5 minutes, directly to the gentleman in the navy suit." I slipped him a $20 bill, more than generous for the favor I was asking. "Thank you so much, Michael. And after you give him the note, I won't be coming back to the table. Could you please bring the check directly to him when they're ready for it?" "Absolutely. Is everything all right? Is there anything else I can do for you?" I managed a small smile, feeling more clear-headed and purposeful than I had in months. "It will be. Thank you for your help." I walked back to the table with my head held high, feeling like I was moving through a dream or watching myself from outside my body. Ashley was showing Daniel something else on her phone, both of them completely absorbed in whatever was on the screen, so focused on their private bubble that they barely looked up when I sat down. "The dessert menu looks absolutely divine," Ashley was saying, her voice carrying that artificial enthusiasm she used when she was performing for an audience. "I think I'll get the tiramisu. It's supposed to be their specialty." "What about you, Daniel? The chocolate souffle sounds amazing, too." "That sounds good. Mom, did you want to share something? They have that lemon cake you like." It was the first time all evening he directly offered to share anything with me, and the irony wasn't lost on me. After 3 hours of being treated like a third wheel, he was finally acknowledging my presence just as I was about to remove myself from his life entirely. "No, thank you. I think I've had enough." "Thank you." I sat quietly, watching them discuss dessert options and wine pairings, marveling at how they could be so completely absorbed in their bubble that they didn't notice the fundamental shift in the atmosphere at our table. Ashley continued to dominate the conversation, telling a long, complicated story about some drama at her office that involved people I'd never met and situations I couldn't possibly care about. 4 minutes, 3 minutes, 2 minutes. I used those final moments to really look at my son, to memorize the way his eyes crinkled when he laughed, the unconscious gesture he made with his hands when he was explaining something, the way he still smoothed his hair when he was thinking hard about something. This was my boy, the child I'd carried for 9 months and raised for 29 years, the person I'd loved with every fiber of my being since the moment I felt him move inside me. But somewhere along the way, I'd lost him to someone who saw me as an obstacle to be managed rather than a person to be respected and cherished. 1 minute. I watched Michael approach our table with professional discretion, the folded napkin in his hand. Ashley and Daniel were still discussing dessert options, completely oblivious to what was about to happen, lost in their own world of shared preferences and inside jokes. "Excuse me, sir," Michael said to Daniel, his voice professional and appropriately respectful. "This is for you." Daniel looked confused as he took the napkin, unfolding it carefully while Ashley tried to peer over his shoulder to see what was written. I watched his face as he read the words I'd written, saw his expression change from confusion to shock, to something that might have been understanding or regret. Ashley was straining to see what was written on the napkin, her curiosity clearly piqued by Daniel's reaction. "What is it, honey? What does it say? Is everything okay?" But I was already standing up, picking up my purse with deliberate calm, and walking toward the exit with my head held high. I didn't look back, didn't wait for their reaction, didn't pause to explain myself or justify my actions. For the first time in 2 years, I was done being managed, controlled, and diminished. I was taking back my dignity, one step at a time. The aftermath. The note I left for Daniel was simple but clear, every word chosen carefully to convey exactly what I needed him to understand. "Son, I love you more than words can express, but I won't sit here and be treated like an unwelcome guest at my own birthday dinner. When you're ready to have a real relationship with your mother again, one that doesn't require your wife's permission or management, call me. Until then, I'll be living my life with people who actually want me around. You deserve better than a marriage that requires you to diminish the people who love you. Happy birthday to me. Love always, Mom." I was halfway across the parking lot when I heard the restaurant door open behind me, followed by quick footsteps on the asphalt and then Daniel's voice calling my name with an urgency I hadn't heard in years. "Mom, Mom, wait. Please." I stopped, but didn't turn around immediately. I needed to see his face to gauge whether this was genuine concern and realization or just damage control orchestrated by Ashley to minimize the embarrassment I'd caused them in such a public setting. When I finally turned around, Daniel was alone. Ashley wasn't hovering behind him with her practiced smile and carefully chosen words of explanation. It was just my son, looking genuinely shaken and confused, his hair slightly messed from hurrying after me and his face pale in the parking lot lights. "What's going on?" he asked, slightly out of breath from running after me in his dress shoes. "Why did you leave like that? Ashley is really upset, and I don't understand what happened." Ashley is upset. Not "I'm upset" or "we're confused" or "I want to understand what's wrong." Ashley is upset, as if her feelings were the primary concern in this situation, as if my walking out of my own birthday dinner was somehow about her rather than about the systematic way she'd been treating me for 2 years. "Daniel, when was the last time you and I had a conversation that lasted more than 5 minutes without Ashley redirecting it, interrupting it, or ending it entirely?" He opened his mouth to respond immediately, then closed it again as the question sank in. I could see him thinking, trying to remember, searching his memory for such a basic interaction between mother and son. The fact that he had to search his memory for something that should have been routine and frequent broke my heart all over again. "That's not... we talk all the time, Mom." "No, son, we exchange pleasantries and logistical information. We discuss surface-level updates about our lives when Ashley permits it. But when was the last time we really talked? When was the last time you asked me how I'm doing and actually waited to hear the answer? When was the last time you shared something important with me before sharing it with everyone else in your life?" Daniel looked uncomfortable, shifting his weight from one foot to the other, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. These were questions he'd apparently never considered, concepts that had never occurred to him, and I could see him struggling to process what I was saying. "I don't understand why you're doing this, Mom. We were having a nice dinner together. It's your birthday." Ashley went out of her way to pick a nice restaurant and make sure everything was perfect for you. "Oh, Ashley told me not to make a scene tonight," I said, my voice steady and clear in the quiet parking lot. "She called me yesterday to coach me on how to behave at dinner with my own son. She spent the entire evening treating me like an unwelcome third wheel, and you've said absolutely nothing about it. That's not—" Ashley wouldn't— He trailed off, and I could see the realization dawning in his eyes as he started to remember the conversation, the dynamics, the way the evening had actually unfolded, rather than how he'd wanted it to unfold in his mind. "Daniel, I raised you to be kind, respectful, and considerate of other people's feelings. I taught you to treat people with dignity and respect, especially the people who love you. What happened to that man I raised?" The question hung in the air between us like a challenge, and I could see him struggling with it, trying to reconcile the person he'd become with the values I'd tried to instill in him throughout his childhood and adolescence. "I love you, Mom," he said finally, and his voice cracked slightly on the words, revealing emotion he'd been keeping carefully controlled. "I love you too, Daniel, but love isn't enough anymore. Love without respect isn't really love at all. It's just obligation wearing a prettier mask. I need to be treated like a human being who matters, not a problem to be managed or an obstacle to be worked around." The resolution and growth. Just as Daniel opened his mouth to respond, the restaurant door opened again, and Ashley emerged into the parking lot. Even from 30 feet away, I could see the controlled fury in her posture, the way she moved with deliberate precision toward us like a missile locked onto its target. Her perfect composure was intact, but there was something predatory and dangerous in her approach that made my skin crawl. "What's going on out here?" she asked when she reached us, her voice carrying that false sweetness that had become her trademark in dealing with me, but with an underlying edge that hadn't been there before. "Daniel, people inside are starting to stare. We should go back and finish our meal like civilized adults." "Ashley," Daniel began, but she cut him off with a gentle hand on his arm, a gesture that looked supportive but was actually controlling. "Margaret, I don't know what this dramatic display is about, but you're embarrassing Daniel and frankly embarrassing yourself. Walking out of dinner like a child having a tantrum isn't the behavior of a mature adult." There it was again, the gaslighting, the manipulation, the way she could twist any situation to make me the villain and herself the reasonable victim. She was standing there in her designer dress and perfect makeup, calling me a child for refusing to accept her systematic campaign to diminish my importance in my son's life. "Ashley," I said, my voice steady and clear, "I've been polite to you for 2 years. I've accepted your exclusion from family events, your interruptions during conversations, your general dismissal of my importance in Daniel's life, but I will not accept being told how to behave at my own birthday dinner." Her mask slipped for just a moment, and I saw something cold and calculating in her eyes before the sweet smile returned, more forced than before. "I don't know what you mean. I've always been nothing but welcoming to you. Daniel, tell your mother she's being unreasonable." And there it was, the moment of truth. Would Daniel finally see what was happening, or would he continue to let his wife orchestrate our relationship according to her preferences and insecurities? Daniel looked between us, and I could see the internal struggle playing out on his face. 2 years of conditioning and manipulation warred with a lifetime of love and respect for his mother. "Ashley," he said slowly, his voice carrying a weight and seriousness I hadn't heard in years, "did you really tell my mom not to make a scene tonight?" The question surprised her. I could see her calculating, trying to figure out how to spin it, how to make it sound reasonable and caring rather than controlling and manipulative. I just wanted tonight to be special for everyone, she said carefully, her voice taking on that victim tone she used when she felt cornered. I know how emotional these family gatherings can get, and I thought it would be better if we kept things light and positive. Emotional? Daniel repeated, and I could hear something dangerous creeping into his voice. What does that mean exactly? I stayed quiet, letting Ashley explain herself without my interference. Sometimes the best way to expose manipulation is to let the manipulator keep talking until they reveal their true intentions. Well, you know how your mother can get when she starts talking about your father or the past. I just thought it might be nice to focus on the present and the future for once, instead of dwelling on things that make everyone sad. Daniel's face changed completely. I could see him processing what she'd just said, realizing that she was essentially telling him that his mother's grief, his father's memory, and their shared history were inconvenient emotions that needed to be managed and controlled rather than honored and respected. My mom gets emotional talking about my dad. Daniel's voice was quiet, but there was an edge to it that made Ashley take a step back. That's not what I meant. My father died when I was 15, Ashley. My mom raised me alone for 8 years after that. Those aren't inconvenient emotions or inappropriate topics of conversation. That's our life, that's our family history, that's who we are. I felt tears prick my eyes, not from sadness but from relief and pride. My son was finally seeing what had been happening, finally recognizing the woman he'd married and the way she'd been systematically erasing me from his life. Daniel, you're misunderstanding what I said. I love your mother. I've always tried to include her in everything. Include her? Daniel's laugh was hollow and bitter. Ashley, when was the last time we invited my mom to anything? When was the last time we spent time with her that wasn't a major holiday or her birthday? The silence that followed was deafening. Ashley opened and closed her mouth several times, clearly unable to come up with an answer that wouldn't further incriminate her. We're going home, Daniel said finally, and tomorrow we're going to have a very serious conversation about what kind of marriage we want to have and what kind of people we want to be. 6 months later, Daniel called to tell me that he and Ashley were getting divorced. The conversation he'd promised that night had revealed fundamental differences in their values and expectations that couldn't be reconciled through counseling or compromise. She couldn't accept that I wanted an independent relationship with you, he explained during one of our regular Sunday dinners that had resumed immediately after their separation. She saw every moment I spent with you, every conversation we had, every memory we shared as a threat to our marriage. I couldn't be married to someone who required me to choose between loving my wife and loving my mother. Was I sad about their divorce? Yes, because I never wanted Daniel to go through that kind of pain and upheaval. But was I relieved that my son had found his way back to himself and to our relationship? Absolutely. Today, Daniel and I have dinner every Sunday again, just like we used to before Ashley entered our lives. Sometimes he brings dates, sometimes it's just the two of us, but it's always his choice, made freely and without anyone else's permission or management. We talk about everything: his work, my volunteer activities, memories of his father, hopes for the future, and all the mundane details of daily life that make up the fabric of a real relationship. I learned something important from that night at Romano's restaurant. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to accept unacceptable treatment, even from the people you love most. Sometimes walking away is the only way to save a relationship. And sometimes standing up for yourself is the greatest gift you can give to someone else, because it gives them permission to remember who they really are. If you've made it this far in my story, thank you for listening to every word. If you're dealing with similar family dynamics, Know that you deserve to be treated with respect and dignity, no matter how much someone claims to love you. Love without respect isn't really love at all. It's just control wearing a prettier mask. Don't let anyone convince you to make yourself smaller so they can feel bigger. You're worth more than that. And the people who truly love you will never ask you to diminish yourself for their comfort or convenience. And sometimes, the note you leave behind is more powerful than anything you could ever say out loud. Sometimes silence speaks louder than words, and sometimes walking away with dignity is the strongest statement you can make. Your worth isn't determined by other people's ability to see it. Remember that, hold on to it, and never let anyone convince you otherwise.